Hello, okay then. So this morning I thought to have a look at, as we've been looking at factions and divisions in the GOP, I thought to have a look at this particular exam question, which would be evaluate the view that the Republican Party is not united or is divided, something like that. And my argument is going to be actually no, I think the Republican Party are pretty well united on the key issues. And the issues I'm going to have a look at for this is social and moral issues. I'm going to look at the economy and taxation. I'm going to have a look at crime, immigration, and guns. I'm going to put them together. Welfare, and also going to have a little quick look at foreign affairs as well. So if you do get a question about divisions and factions within the parties, and how united one is, or both of them are, or whatever, I would focus on the main kind of ideas or policies which those parties have. So as I said, my argument is basically going to be, actually I think the GOP is pretty united to a large extent. Okay, so let's look at moral issue first. So to say that they're united, I think most Republicans are socially conservative to a larger or smaller extent. All but a handful are pro-life. All but a handful are kind of not that comfortable with gay marriage. And I think these issues unite quite a lot of social conservatives, because remember, conservatives believe that humans are psychologically and morally, in this case, flawed. And of course, you've got the strength of the evangelical Christian vote within the GOP, which kind of drives this kind of moral kind of conviction amongst many Republicans. So, let's look at the issue of abortion first of all. I can only think of one senator who is not in favour of pro-life. So most Republicans in favour of pro-life. Most Republicans celebrated, if that's the right word, the overturning of Roe versus Wade with the Dobbs case by the Supreme Court a couple of years ago. And you saw a number of Republican-run states very quickly pass legislation making it more difficult to get abortions in their states. So you saw, for example, I think it's Alabama, for example, which has even gone further and is talking about stopping IVF treatments. You've seen states like Texas and Oklahoma and all these sorts of states making life more difficult in order to get abortions. You've also seen previously quite a lot of legislation being introduced by Republicans on the issue of abortion, like the Heartbeat Act, which Mike Johnson, who's the current Speaker of the House of Representatives, supported back in 2021, I think it was. And if you go back further in time as well, if you go back to George Bush Sr., he was down in the late 80s, early 90s. He passed legislation called the Mexico City Rule, which basically forbade foreign aid from the United States, which goes to the third world, to be spent on abortion issues. This was also reinforced by his son, President George W. Bush, and also by Donald Trump as well. And to add into all this, you could argue that all Republican presidents recently have appointed pro-life justices onto the Supreme Court. So Donald Trump's 3 appointments onto the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, have all been quite strong pro-life candidates or Supreme Court justices as they are now. And this has led, hasn't it, in large part to the Dobbs case, essentially. On other issues to do with social and moral issues, if we look at gay and trans rights, for example, it was Donald Trump who rescinded or overturned Obama's guidance to schools that they should provide facilities for transgender students. You've seen on the issue of gay marriage, for example, many Republicans very uncomfortable with Obergefell versus Hodges, that Supreme Court case which effectively legalised it. Some governors, like the former governor of Virginia, Governor Youngkin, who's leaving his office in a couple of months' time, or Governor DeSantis of Florida, they've sought to ban books in schools which shows kind of, two boys holding hands and things like that. And so, therefore, I would argue the Republican Party is pretty united over the issue of abortion and social and moral issues. And this goes from the moderate Republicans through to the very strong social conservatives. However, we have to now do a counter-argument to this. I think it's quite a weak counter-argument, but you could argue that some social conservatives go a step too far for some of the moderate social conservatives within the GOP. So, for example, not many states have gone as far as Alabama, who wish to ban IVF treatments, for example. Most of them are just quite happy just to ban abortions, essentially. There is one pro-life senator who's Republican in the Senate, which is Susan Collins of Maine. Maine is a relatively liberal state. However, she often does vote for pro-life stuff. She did vote for the 3 pro-life Supreme Court judges, so I'm not quite sure how far we can take her credibility on this particular issue. Regarding gay marriage, I mean, Dick Cheney, or the late Dick Cheney now, the former vice president under George W. Bush, his daughter, it turns out, is gay, and he accepted her marriage to another woman. So clearly he did change his mind on this issue and it affected his family. I am kind of pulling at straws a little bit here, I have to fully admit, to show where the divisions within the GOP on this issue as social and moral issues. They do seem, in my view, pretty united on this issue. You're just talking about degrees, I suppose, to which they're opposed to this. Talking about degrees to which they agree with each other over this particular issue. Okay then, so the next issue then is over guns, crime and immigration. I'm going to kind of bung them all together, so to speak. So, where are Republicans united on this issue? Well, they all take quite a tough line on crime. Recently, they've taken quite a tough line collectively on immigration. So, for example, and also on guns, I think it's very difficult to find any Republicans who wish to get rid of guns or really challenge the Second Amendment. So, for example, again, it's largely been those Supreme Court justices appointed by Republicans who have sought to protect the Second Amendment and overturn state laws which have sought to restrict gun regulations. It's the Republican Party who collectively, through President Trump, have really beefed up immigration, and it's the Republican Party who have put the extra funding in Trump wanting to build the wall. I've not really heard a great deal of opposition from many Republicans about Donald Trump's use of the ICE forces against sanctuary cities. So therefore, they do seem pretty united on this issue of guns and also on the issue of immigration and immigration control. And I'd also say that most Republicans as well are pretty united around the death penalty as well, as are a number of Democrats, but we're just talking about the Republican Party here. So, for example, it's the Republicans down in South Carolina, which have introduced or reintroduced the firing squad to be used on executions. I can't remember what state it was now. One of the states introduced nitrogen gas as well, which was a Republican state. I think it might be in Alabama, but I might be wrong, as a way to execute prisoners. Donald Trump, in his first term as president, he actually oversaw the executions of more federal prisoners. So these ones not held by the state, but held by the federal government. He oversaw the execution of more federal prisoners than any president in the last 100 years. So I think it's fair to say that they are pretty united and pretty strong on the issues of guns and crime and that type of stuff. Now, the counter-argument is that some of them are a bit less, some of them are a bit more understanding of certain crimes. So, for example, Joe Biden, back in 2022, introduced some gun control into Congress, and 14 Republicans voted for it. This gun legislation was quite weak in many ways, but I suppose it was some regulation. It sought, for example, to increase money towards mental health. It sought to put various checks on certain types of weapons held by certain people. So it was some gun legislation, and 14 Republicans broke ranks with the rest of the party in the House of Representatives and supported it. Regarding immigration, again, there is some disquiet among some Republicans over immigration. So, for example, some of the strong fiscal conservatives, like, for example, Rand Paul, are a bit unhappy with the amount of money that was spent or proposing to be spent in Trump's first term on building that wall. It was more of a financial concern which he had. Joe Biden as well. He also introduced an immigration reform, and many Republicans in the Senate initially supported this bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans working together on some immigration reform. It wasn't until Donald Trump kind of said, don't, because I want to make it into an election issue, that they all decided not to support it after all. So it does suggest that some Republicans are willing, I suppose, to be a little bit kind of less hostile or less unwilling to hurt others over the issue of immigration. And therefore there might be some division amongst Republicans over this particular issue. Oh, I've just thought, by the way, just going back to the social and moral for a division, 4 Republicans did vote yesterday or the day before to release the Epstein list, which other Republicans, including Donald Trump, didn't want to be released. Which again, you could say that's a moral issue, couldn't you? And 4 Republicans did vote to release them. So that's a little division which has come up. And it was Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's been quite vocal on this issue, was one of them. So there's another bit for the divisions in the GOP on social and moral stuff. Okay then, so we've done crime and guns and stuff, we've done social and moral. Right, the economy. I think it's fair to say that Republicans are pretty united over this idea of limited government and tax cuts. This goes back to the days of Ronald Reagan. It probably goes back even further, if we're being perfectly honest with you. Traditionally, the Republican Party have supported reducing budget deficits and, as I said, tax cuts. We saw some of this under Donald Trump. So in Trump 1, in 2017, he passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which cut around $1.7 trillion of taxes, mainly from corporations. We've also seen Donald Trump in 2025 pass what was known as the Big Beautiful Bill, which was also about tax cuts, related to wealthy individuals, which suggests, and again, most Republicans voted for that as well, which suggests that the Republicans are quite united around this idea of tax cuts. Also, Republicans have voted in a pretty united way against the increased spending introduced by Democrats. So, for example, when Joe Biden introduced the American Rescue Plan, this was following COVID. This was $9 trillion of federal spending. Every Republican voted against it. Joe Biden also passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which again was about investment in green energy and things like that. Again, all the Republicans voted against it. So they seem pretty united in voting against some of the big spending proposals by Joe Biden and other Democrats, and they seem pretty united in supporting legislation which introduces some kind of tax cuts. I'd also say they're pretty united as well over issues like, Donald Trump issued executive orders which overturned some of the environmental regulations put in place by Obama and then put in place again by Joe Biden. Again, Republicans tend to favour deregulation and the state not playing a massive role in the economy. So, pretty united, I would say, on those issues. However, I would argue there are also some divisions on these things. Some Republicans were not very happy, it has to be said, with some of the budget deficits which might occur from some of these tax cuts. So Trump's Big Beautiful Bill did see 3 Republican senators voting against it. Most prominently is Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's voted against these. He claimed he's going to create, I think it was 250 million, or was it billion? Not much difference there, is there? 250 something anyway, I think it might have been billion, budget deficit, and therefore he said he couldn't support it for that reason. There were other Republican senators who had actually criticised this legislation but then voted for it, I think because they feared that what Trump might do in primaries against them. So there's obviously some disquiet around the budget deficit being fuelled by the Big Beautiful Bill. And then we've got the tariffs. Again, it's an awkward issue, isn't it? Because traditionally the Republican Party has been in favour of free trade, and the tariffs obviously go very much against the issue of free trade. And we have seen some of that recently, haven't we, about Ronald Reagan in the 80s saying how terrible tariffs were, yet Trump has introduced tariffs. most Republicans, with a few exceptions, like our old friend Rand Paul, have been very quiet on this issue on the tariffs. But I do wonder how much they really support Donald Trump and the tariffs, and I wonder, if the tariffs do have a negative impact on things like the economy and stuff, whether they'll begin to break ranks. So I think there's some tensions there, I would argue, in the GOP over tariffs. Again, if they begin to break ranks before your exams, then obviously that would lead to bigger divisions. But I think I'd definitely say there's some tensions there over the tariffs. Okay then, so the next area I'll look at is welfare. Health and welfare basically. And I think most Republicans are pretty united on this issue. Most of them believe in individualism. Individuals are responsible for their own kind of welfare in many ways. Many Republicans don't like massive welfare programs. So, for example, every single Republican voted against the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, that was passed in 2009, or was it 2010? No, 2009. All but 3 Republicans voted to repeal Obamacare under Trump won. So that shows a pretty united Republican Party on these particular issues. In 2018, most Republicans voted as well to reduce the budget for SNAP. SNAP is this program which basically is food stamps and food to Americans who can't afford food. So it's a food program in that way. Most Republicans voted to reduce the budget by about 30%. So this would all suggest, wouldn't it, that welfare is something which most Republicans think should be reduced, has got too big, and therefore have voted against extending it, etc., etc. However, as a counter to this, you could argue, well, actually, the Affordable Care Act hasn't been repealed. The Republicans, they've run the presidency and the Congress for 2 years under Trump 1. They're in charge of both at the moment, yet the Affordable Care Act seems to keep carrying on. In 2017, it was 3 Republican senators who basically voted against getting rid of Obamacare, which led to it staying in place, effectively. And therefore, that does show there's some division. The recent shutdown, which has ended earlier this week, there were some Republicans who realised that programmes like SNAP and even the Affordable Care Act does have some popularity among some people of their cities or states and districts, which has led to a weakening of the resolve of the GOP over this shutdown. People like Susan Collins of Maine, but actually Marjorie Taylor Greene down in Georgia as well. I think quite a few of her constituents as well received some of these programmes. So again, some criticisms began to be aired around this idea of the shutdown. So welfare, they're pretty united, although there are some on the edges who are less keen on it. Okay, and then finally, foreign policy. Again, traditionally, and I think they're pretty well united on this, the Republican Party has been quite pro-Israel. This goes back to the 1940s. You've seen presidents from the Republican Party supporting the Israeli government, providing weapons and stuff to Israel. Donald Trump, in his first term, moved the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was quite a controversial move. Recently, with the war with Gaza, though there's been a few tensions, hasn't there, with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, I think still Trump has been quite supportive generally of the Israeli government and provided weapons, etc., etc. Traditionally, the Republican Party has also been very pro-NATO and what they see as their European allies. They've also been very pro kind of extending American interests around the world in various ways. And again, you could say that they're pretty united on this still. I know Trump, has been accused of being less keen on NATO, and he's upset some key US allies like Canada, for example. But generally speaking, especially in Trump too, he's not talked about leaving NATO, has he? He just says that the other member states need to make a big contribution as well. It shouldn't just be on the United States, which is quite popular, I think, amongst most Republicans and probably quite a few Democrats as well. So I would say on foreign policy, relatively united on this issue are most Republicans. However, there are some divisions over foreign policy. I think Trump's issue with the Ukraine, initially the Republicans supported the Democrats and Joe Biden in supporting the Ukraine against Russia. Russia, of course, has been a traditional enemy of the United States, especially since the communist days. However, Trump has been far more ambiguous towards the Ukraine. He's been less keen to give weapons, hasn't, to the Ukraine. When Biden was president, it was many Republicans who actually were very concerned about the amount of money and weapons that were being sent to the Ukraine. And again, it was just a handful of those Republicans who caused those problems. So I think there's clearly some kind of split here in the GOP over the Ukraine and how much support should be given to it. I think some of the neoconservatives within the GOP, some of the foreign policy hawks, for want of a better word, I think they are a bit concerned about Trump's attitude towards NATO and the amount of support he might give to it. Some Republicans are less keen that America should be involved in world affairs, and I'm kind of, again, this MAGA movement, isn't it? It's about America first, and should America withdraw itself from being so involved? Yeah, Donald Trump does seem quite involved in quite a lot of world affairs. So there's obviously some issues and some various splits taking place here. So, overall, I think the GOP is pretty united. I think quite a few of my divisions and splits have just been a small numbers who not like this bit and not like that bit, but generally tend to agree. And once or twice I have kind of struggled a little bit to think of divisions like on social and moral issues, for example. So I would argue that the GOP is pretty united on most of these sorts of issues. How long that lasts, I don't know. Will it last as long as your exam? Who knows? But I think they're pretty united over social and moral issues, guns, crime and immigration, limited government in the economy, welfare and foreign policy.